First of all, the country has some very serious problems now. And part of it is a function of what I would call, what other people have called the great sorting out. People have literally moved to where they feel more culturally comfortable. And so as a result, you have these huge divides along the cultural lines. I will say this, because I lived through 1968. I think the cleavages then were more serious than they are now. There's a lot of yelling now and a lot of name calling and ad hominem attacks right now. So I think in many ways the country was more divided and more seriously split in 1968. So, looking at this in more of a perspective, I'm not saying we're better now. I'm not saying we're going to be safe. What is more frightening now than in 1968 is our guardrails of democracy are much more fragile.
This is Frank Schaeffer, and you are watching and or listening to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. This is a podcast that first is a live event on Facebook and then goes to everywhere from YouTube to Substack to whatever, but and then can be found wherever podcasts are found. And just to say, if you like this podcast, please like it in the online sense of liking things and share it. Today, I'm talking with Anthony J. Mohr, if I said your last name correctly.
Yes.
And Anthony is a Superior Court judge. He's also the author of Every Other Weekend, Coming of Age with Two Different Dads. And Anthony, can I ask you up front a little housekeeping question? Have you written other books?
Only a legal textbook, actually 2 legal textbooks.
Okay.
And Thomson Reuters published them, but no other books like this or trade books, if you will.
Yeah. Well, the reason I mention that is I write for a living and have earned my living doing that for the last 40 years. When I dug into your book, into the prologue, I'm a writer who has a chip on his shoulder about people who are non-writers writing books, thinking, okay, sometimes they have something interesting to say in terms of nonfiction and you read them. But I have to tell you, I found your prologue and the rest of the book, but just let's start with the opening pages, absolutely enthralling. And found that I was writing that I would pay to read for entertainment and pleasure and insight. I just don't know where you became a writer, but you most certainly are one. I'm sort of stunned because you're pitched as a judge, and somewhere along the way you have picked up the chops to be a very beguiling writer. I just love how the book starts and how I was drawn in, not expecting to be, thinking that, the book would be interesting because it deals with issues that are interesting. 2 fathers, a father and a stepfather, bouncing between the two. So I want to start with a sort of off-the-wall question. Why are you such a good writer? I know that's a crazy question to start an interview with, but forget the judge stuff and all your logbooks behind you. Who the hell are you? Why can you write so well? Is it to do with the artistic chops you have from your father, who was an actor and did voice things back in the day? I mean, where did this part of you come from? I just don't get it.
Well, thank you again for having me on your show, first of all. And as a judge or a lawyer would say, we object. It assumes the existence of facts, not in evidence.
Yeah.
Assuming for the moment that I'm a good writer, and I hope I am.
Yeah.
I've always enjoyed writing. My father was a very good writer. I wished he had done writing for scripts or for a living, because when he did it, when he would write a treatment or two, which he did, they were really, captivating. He had a very lyrical style, but he just didn't do that. But I always enjoyed writing. I mostly in journalism. I was edited my school newspaper. I was managing editor of my college paper. I was on bar journals and edited a couple of them. I just kept moving into that area, journalism being my second love, if you will. But in being a judge, you really can't go around writing articles and op-eds. You're very limited. And even now, I'm retired, but I still sit on assignment. So I still, from time to time, am quote unquote a judge. And so I guess just to keep the habit going, I got more into creative nonfiction. Started working with memoir, and I've written a number of personal essays, some of which have been published, and several are in the book, in this particular book. So I would just, the short answer to your question is practice.
Well, I'm sorry we've come late to it because I think it came out in February. Is that correct?
That's correct.
The book's been out. And I just want to tell people again, usually I get a hard copy and hold the cover up, but we will put the artwork wherever this is. Ernie, our producer, will make sure that there are links to this so we don't have to pitch it that way. But I want to just say again, the title is Every Other Weekend, Coming of Age with Two Different Dads. And there's a lot about this book I want to talk about in terms of the story it tells, but I want to do something different first before we get into who you are and your story and all the rest of that. And that is, I would like to take a minute and just read how this book opens, because it's a stunning beginning to a book. And let me begin by just reading from the prologue here. Do you call it a prologue? Yes, the prologue. Gerald Mohr, father, Stanley Dashu. Just tell me the name. How do you say his name?
Dashu. Think of a cashew nut, but with a D.
So let me start again. Gerald Mohr, father, Stanley Dashu, stepfather. I still compare those two powers, the actor and the businessman, whose lives intersected across one woman and her son, my mother and me. From their respective marriages in 1958 through Gerald's early death in 1968, they never lived more than a few miles apart, which made it easy for me to see them, but not easy to choose between them. And I really have to be honest with you. I literally got chills reading that again to you just now. I just think that's one of the most powerful beginnings to a work that I've read. And I'm saying fiction or nonfiction, all of the above. And I just have to tell people who are listening to this podcast that the context in which he writes this is an incredibly different story than I was expecting, in that it's the influence of two men on your life. And if I get it right from the book, I think that you had not married or had children, and you married, I should say, finally at 68 or something like that.
66 years old.
66. So it's a book about family dynamic, but told, if I can be so bold, from the perspective of someone who took that dynamic as the formative experience of his life, your life, and then went on and became, I would guess you would say, a male of the species, cast in the mold of these two very different men, having learned both what you wanted to be from them and also a little bit of what you didn't want to be. But you took away those lessons and turned them into a life of great achievement in terms of becoming a judge. I don't know how to summarize the book, except at the beginning, when you have all those nice things people have said about it, I was sort of going through that and thinking that my own feeling about the book is very much reflected in those comments. I really just think it's a stunning work. So I guess my first question to you is, since one of your fathers lived till a very old age, was he 98?
96 and a half.
96 and a half. Sorry, I'm a little off on the math on these things.
That's okay.
But I'm getting it in the ballpark. The other gentleman died quite early, quite young.
Right. Yeah, he was 54 when he died.
Tell the story a little bit to me, as if we just met on an airplane and I said, what's your book about? I just want you to give me the thumbnail instead of me presuming to do it.
It's basically about, my, preteen to pre-teen years, going through a divorce, having both parents remarry when I was 11 years old, and then toggling between the two fathers all the way from 6th grade up through the high school. And and they were very, very different people. I mean, my dad was an actor, kind of in B movies and a lot of television work. He was a big radio star, but really once radio kind of slipped and TV came in, he had to adjust, and it was a difficult adjustment. And Stan was this hard-bitten conservative businessman who his one hobby in life was sailing. And my father, was a polymath. He talked about everything and anything. Stan, really, the conversation was sailing or his business. My dad was a bon vivant. He lived life large. He was a womanizer. Stan was a very faithful husband. And so I saw two different worlds. And ironically, my father, though he was quite well known, had less and less money as time went on. And Stan, who of course wasn't known, because how many in business are, unless you're Jack Welch or Warren Buffett or someone like that, he had tons of money. He was even featured in a book called You Only Have to Get Rich Once. So, one weekend I'm living in Beverly Hills, the life of Riley. We're on his large boat. It was the largest catamaran on the West Coast at the time. The next weekend, I'm in my dad's rented house, in West Hollywood, ultimately in Beverly Hills. And money's tight, and his wife was always crabbing about not having money. His second wife was constantly complaining about funds being very limited. So it went back and forth.
Yeah, there's an interesting little tie-in here that I want to draw attention to early in our conversation, let you riff on it a little bit. You know how when you read a book or you hear a story, if there's some part that intersects your own life, even tangentially, you kind of perk right up. There's a line here: Stan's Republican credentials reach back to 1948 to the group of businessmen in Grand Rapids, Michigan, who recruited Gerald Ford to run for Congress. Why did that jump out at me? Because in my own life in the 1970s, I produced a couple film series for my evangelist conservative father called How Should We Then Live? And then another one, Whatever Happened to the Human Race, with Dr. Siebert Koop, who became Ronald Reagan Surgeon General. And through a whole series of events, those were funded by the DeVos family that became a kind of
Amway, of course.
Movers and shakers in Grand Rapids. I knew Gerald Ford pretty well.
Excuse me.
What's that?
I just sneezed. I'm sorry.
Oh yeah, I knew Gerald Ford pretty well, and he became friends with our family. His son Mike stayed with us for a year at my dad's mission in Switzerland. His daughter-in-law Gail babysat my daughter Jessica. I knew everybody in Grand Rapids involved with the Ford family. My question to you, without rambling into my story, after, Richard Nixon and all the rest of it, was that I wondered if you reconnected with any of those Republican, I guess you could call it establishment connections over time, or whether that sort of ran dry and that's just part of your dad's story.
It didn't run dry at all.
Talk to me about it.
My dad's story was Democratic all the way.
Yeah.
Including Bobby Kennedy, and he was at the Ambassador when Bobby was killed. But on Stan's side,
and he heard the gunshots in the Ambassador Hotel. Yes, I knew that, and I get which dad we're talking about, because you've got these two dads running through it, and I'm bad on names. But talk to me about the Grand Rapids connection and how that might have played out in your life.
I decided in college I was going to be a government major, although I came to it late, somewhere at the end of my junior year, and I wanted to work in Washington. And I didn't know which way to go. I mean, there was a side of me that was a Democrat, but the side of me that was Republican, because of who my parents were. And basically, Stan helped me get an internship in Nixon's 1968 campaign.
Yeah.
And I was very lucky because I ended up working right under some of the very major leaders of that campaign. Pat Hitt, who ran the women's division, and ultimately became an assistant secretary of, at that time, Health, Education, and Welfare. I worked with John Ehrlichman at the convention. I worked with Richard Kleindienst at the Republican National Committee. And I worked with Robert Ellsworth, who became ambassador to NATO. I mean, I was just a little kid doing research and writing a few press releases here and there, but it was fabulous. I loved it. And I always planned to go back after law school and work in the re-election campaign, because this was the summer of '68. Sure. And Wesleyan, my college, let me stay down there and gave me credit for working all the way through the election, which was wonderful, because if I had dropped out, I would have been drafted back then. But in any case, we get to 1972 and they hired me back. They wanted me to be there, but they offered me a job that didn't sound right. It was with a guy named Ed Thaler, and it sounded like I was going to be in the Dirty Tricks campaign, that section. And I went back and forth with it, and Stan, God love him, said, this doesn't sound right to me either. And we went through a really painful weekend, and I ended up turning it down. Instead, I took a clerkship. 1 week later was the Watergate break-in. And I obviously did not work for the committee to reelect the president. And that life dream of working for
Right.
Nixon and working in the White House, which they promised me, never came to pass. I did get active in local politics in California. I helped Hugh Flournoy when he ran for governor, he lost. And I helped Hugh Wilson when he ran for governor and he won.
And he won, yeah.
Yeah. And, Wilson appointed me to the municipal court. And so politics was something I always enjoyed. I have written about it. This book doesn't get into it because the timing is different, but I have written some essays about working in the Nixon campaign and what happened after that.
Did you meet Chuck Colson?
I did not.
Okay. The reason I ask is that's another intersection, one degree of separation, because Chuck then had a born again experience after he got arrested and thrown in prison for a while for not having anybody in his family that warned him off. You had better advice.
I was lucky. I met H.R. Haldeman after Watergate. He was on the Tom Snyder show. A friend of mine who was an attorney at NBC invited me to the taping, and Haldeman and I had a very nice discussion. His daughter is a mediator, Susan Haldeman, and she's a delight. I don't know her well, but what I know of her, I like a lot.
Yes.
I did. This is ironic. When I was a full-time judge, Donald Segretti appeared in front of me for a case. And this is long afterwards. He had gotten his bar license back and served his time. And he was a perfect gentleman. It was a pleasure to have him in my court. It was only a one-off situation. Yeah. But I just remember sitting there thinking, wow, I've got this guy from the Watergate team sitting in my court, and he's, now he's a solid citizen.
Did you ever run into any, as a judge, did you run into any either repercussions of or connections with what Chuck did in later years when after he'd become a born again Christian, he went out and did this prison ministry for prison reform, and people on both the right and the left kind of respected what he was doing in that. I just wondered if you ever had anybody before you as a judge that had anything to do with that in the good sense of his involvement with that whole issue.
Our paths didn't cross.
Okay. I'm fishing for something here. That's because let's roll back to Grand Rapids. What did your connection remain with Michigan, as in politics or people you knew out of that milieu going back to 48 or whenever it was? Well,
Stan had worked in Grand Rapids for Addressograph Multigraph. I obviously didn't know him then. I met him 10 years later when he had moved to California. Yeah. So I never was in Michigan, don't know anybody there, although I have friends there now from the White House Conference on Youth and from other political forays along the way, and from the ALI at Harvard, the Advanced Leadership Initiative. But I really had no professional connections with Grand Rapids or with the state of Michigan.
Yeah. Let me just fast forward to something here that's not on the book, but just jumps out at me from the bio, of what you're involved with now. Tell us what this ALI Social Impact Review at Harvard is about. How did you get involved with that? What do you do there? And just describe what that is, because that's something I think you're involved in at this point.
Right. Well, Harvard has a program called the Advanced Leadership Initiative, or what we call the ALI. And it's really for people who are going into the third chapter of their lives, folks who have had a career and they're retiring, but they don't want to just go out and, solve crossword puzzles for the rest of their lives. They want to do something to help the world, something of social impact. And a friend of mine recruited me into the program during COVID. And I applied, and I fortunately was accepted. They usually take about 40 to 50 people. And my year was virtual because of COVID, although we did get some in-person time later at the end of 2021 and into 2022. They started a journal called the Social Impact Review. And being your frustrated journalist, wannabe writer, I gravitated toward that and joined the staff. And I became one of their editors and still am. And right now I'm in charge of their op-eds and commentary areas. So the job is try to find people to write for us. If we want to write ourselves, we can. The op-eds cover all our domains, which are democracy, human rights, health, climate change, education, race relations, the whole gamut. And the only thing we want for our articles is to advocate to have policy recommendations in the social impact field.
So do you get to Harvard much? Where are you sitting right now? You're in
Los Angeles.
You're in LA. So how does that work with the East Coast travel thing, or is it still virtual?
It's all virtual. Our editorial board meetings are all virtual. We did have an in-person reunion and gathering last December. And my hope is we'll do it again in early this December.
So let me just reintroduce. This is Frank Schaeffer. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, a podcast that I do, produced by Ernie Gregg. Our guest today is Anthony J. Mohr, who is a judge. Am I supposed to say is a judge or retired? What's the right way to address this?
Technically, I'm a retired judge, but still sitting on assignment.
Well, there you are. And he's doing interesting things at Harvard with the ALI, which is the Advanced Leadership Initiative.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And on social impact review. Let me change the subject drastically here. You're old enough and have seen enough and experienced enough of American life and have written so well about your own experiences as the son in this, I won't call it a divided childhood because, with these two fathers, or a father and a stepfather. And I note that all takes place sort of before divorce became a thing. And, this is pre-Johnny Carson joking about it on The Tonight Show, about hiding your money and stuff. This is an altogether much closer to the World War II era, completely different kind of world. I would like you to reflect a little bit on what you've seen. I'm not fishing for anything, but it seems to me that the arc of your life experience, having been involved with Nixon, start that, as point of departure. We live in a very fraught political moment. The first president in history has been indicted for, I guess you could say, almost high crimes and misdemeanors that make Watergate look rather trivial by comparison. I'm just curious, how do you view our situation in the States right now, having lived a big chunk of life as a responsible person involved with the law? I come from a evangelical right-wing Christian background that I left, and I'm very much on the other side of things politically now in some ways. In other ways, I kind of understand the frustration of the religious right and other people in terms of the changes which have been so huge in what's called the culture war battles and so forth. I have a lot of time to kind of reflect on these things, and I make commentaries and so forth. I'm really interested in an open-ended riff from you on what you've seen, how things have changed, and where you think this landscape is now in terms of politics, the law, culture wars, where things are going. Have at it.
Well, it's hard to say. First of all, the country has some very serious problems now. And part of it is a function of what I would call, what other people have called the great sorting out. People have literally moved to where they feel more culturally comfortable. So somebody who grew up in San Francisco, who is more of a Republican, even a moderate Republican, might say, look, I don't want to be here anymore. I'm going to move to Idaho, or I'm going to move to Texas. And somebody in Texas who says, look, I don't want to be around all these holy rollers or whatever, I'm going to move to San Francisco. And so as a result, you have these huge divides along the cultural lines. I think people are very united along areas like national defense. I think you could find somebody from San Francisco and somebody from Alabama, and they would still agree the country has to defend itself. But in terms of culture, it doesn't. It's sad. I will say this, because I lived through 1968. I think the cleavages then were more serious than they are now. There's a lot of yelling now and a lot of name calling and ad hominem attacks right now. But in 1968, there were bombings. You had groups like the Weathermen beginning to take hold. They lasted longer. I think they went into 1970, 71, I forget. But you had that. You had huge demonstrations. Lyndon Johnson, had he run for re-election, would not have been able to campaign safely anywhere but on military bases. Donald Trump and Joe Biden can campaign anywhere. Their lives are not in danger, or maybe they are, but they have better security. In the 60s, we had 3 assassinations, serious. You had Martin Luther King and the 2 Kennedys. So far, knock on wood, we haven't had that in the 2000s or in 2023 so far. We hope it's the same. So I think in many ways the country was more divided and more seriously split in 1968. So, looking at this in more of a perspective, I'm not saying we're better now. I'm not saying we're going to be safe. What is more frightening now than in 1968 is our guardrails of democracy are much more fragile. In 1968, despite all the demonstrations, despite all the bombings, despite the movements for Black Power, you had no one trying to overthrow the government. Now you do. And the guardrails are much more flimsy. There's a book, I forget the names of the authors, but the book is called How Democracies Die. I've read it. I would commend it to anybody because it talks about how a country that used to be free turns into an autocracy. And they go back and they look at Germany in 1933. They look at Chile. They look at other countries, Turkey, for example. And you can see what would happen. You elect a president who's authoritarian. On that person's coattails, in comes a Congress that's going to do his bidding. He'll appoint judges who will do exactly what he wants. The judges are more partisan. They don't believe in judicial independence anymore. So you pass a bill which is going to restrict people's rights. You take the bill to court. The judges are going to uphold it, even if it's technically unconstitutional. And slowly but surely, the country slips into an authoritarian ethos. That was never the case in before. The only time we had, as far as I can tell, and I was too young to know it, the Red Scare. That was, that scared a lot of people, and a lot of people were afraid to say what they believed and do what they wanted to do. But McCarthy, thank God, because of the people like Joe Welch and finally the Senate that censured them, he went, he dropped out of view, dropped out of sight. This time, as I said, the democracy is much more fragile. And then we have the other problems like climate change, which I think is an extremely serious problem. I don't think people have recognized it as such, at least a number of people have not. But if we don't solve this, it's very possible that everything we're talking about won't make a whit of difference. Have I riffed enough?
You've riffed well, and you have reflected weirdly, because we're not rehearsing any of this, exactly what I've been trying to say and what my concerns have been. You and I are thinking along exactly the same lines, up into and including what you're talking about in terms of the environment and climate change. I would agree with you. I was around in 1968 as well, and grew up, along with that whole movement of division from the left and right. And I think there was more civil unrest. It just seems to me that, at the time we were involved with Republican politics, my family, that Nixon stepped down at the behest of the leaders of his own party, who told him it's time to go, and he went. And now we see people with Trump basically making excuses for him, way beyond anything that would have seemed imaginable. I'm 71, and I look back, and there are things happening now that if you had told me they would have happened 30, 40, 50 years ago, I would have just said that's unthinkable. That's science fiction. It will never happen. I don't know. Do you share that sentiment?
Yeah. I mean, when I was in high school, I mean, if somebody had said to me that you're going to have an attempted coup or insurrection at the Capitol, I'd laugh at them. I'd say, oh, come on.
Yeah.
We had a lot more faith in the government back then. My wife and I, a couple of nights ago, decided not to watch a spy movie. We watched, actually, it was a spy movie. It's called The FBI Story. And there is a section where they're going after spies from the Soviet Union. But what was amazing at the end, there's this tribute to J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI, who keep our nation safe. You couldn't make that movie today. People would laugh it off the screen. I remember I was sort of a big fan of the Mickey Mouse Club, and they had a series called The FBI, or Your FBI, and they had, I think it was Mooch. There was this little kid called Mooch, and he narrated this 1 week series about the FBI keeping us safe. And it was a Valentine to the agency. No question about it. You couldn't put that on television today. We just don't trust our institutions. And we used to trust the Supreme Court a lot more than we do now. I mean, poll after poll sees the Supreme Court as much more politicized than it used to be. Even when Earl Warren had the liberal court and they were coming down with decisions like Mapp versus Ohio, Miranda against Arizona, and gosh knows how many others, people didn't, I mean, other than the fringe groups who said impeach Earl Warren, people respected the court. And now there's less of that. It's sad. It really is. I think Justice Roberts is trying to keep it together. I think he wants to have a court that is respected, but he's having trouble.
That's a great segue into what I was going to do next anyway. We're thinking in tandem here. I wanted to reintroduce you briefly and just say that you're the author of a wonderful book, Every Other Weekend. Really a remarkable story of being raised in really these two households, not really competing, but just such different worldview and then such different histories of these two men. And I love walking away from reading this with the idea that you respected these two men with their flaws, and see them for who they were, and at the same time grateful for what they gave you. It's a very uplifting story in that sense. I want to shift gears here and talk to you about what you observed as a judge. First of all, forgive me, I should know this from your bio material, but I'm bad on numbers. How many years were you a judge, or are you?
About 27. I was appointed to the municipal court in 94. And then the governor elevated me to the Superior Court here in California in 97. And I served straight through to 2021 when I retired. And then I went back to Harvard for the ALI. And when the Advanced Leadership Initiative ended, I became an assigned judge, which was last year. And so from time to time, I sit, like this week, I happen to be sitting.
Can you describe the kind of cases that you saw, but also just, again, a little bit of history here, because that's a long enough arc to have observed some things. What changes did you perceive during that 25-year period from when you were first appointed till now? We've been talking about the disrespect of the FBI, government in general. And I just want to point out a little footnote, which I know you know already, to those listening. And that is that, again, I'm only 71. I'm not Methuselah here, but I've lived long enough to have seen a big change. And that was, speaking of 1968 and the unrest then, that was basically coming from the left. The conservatives, the Republicans, were the people talking about law and order and respect for the courts and precedent and tradition. And now, it's a bewildering reversal for somebody who's 71 to see that the winds of insurrection and change and revolution and disrespect for government are coming from the right today. And that's a huge shift that I guess you have to be my generation or your generation to have seen. In the arc of your span of time on the bench and as a judge in, I guess, the most happening state in the country, in the sense that all the trends come from California. So you're not just a judge anywhere, you're a judge where things set precedents, not just in the legal sense, that actually then change everything, whether it's emissions from cars or whatever for the whole country. Your little slice of history here covers a lot of change and a lot of time. I'm just wondering what you observed from that period. What have you seen and what conclusions do you draw?
Frank, as you were talking, a song by The Who came to mind. And the lyric is, "Greet the new boss, same as the old boss." Okay, you had the people from the left wanting to take over the country. Now you have the people from the right wanting to take over the country. They may be the same. Should they have won? I think it would have been the same. It would have been, it would be like Animal Farm. All animals are equal, but some are more equal than others.
Yeah.
And, the pig would have ended up being the same pig for whichever wing you're talking about. And Napoleon the horse would end up dead.
Yep. In any case, I will work harder, is what he kept saying.
I will work harder. Exactly. One of the best lines George Orwell wrote when he said, "It seemed that the words 'I will work harder' were written on his lips."
Yeah.
I'll never forget that line.
Yeah.
It's one of the best. It's one of the best.
Yeah.
Really is.
Give
I
us some more. That's a good observation. Where are you going with that in terms of what you've seen from the bench?
Well, the biggest change I've seen was brought on by COVID. Everything now is on online, on Zoom, on WebEx, on Microsoft Teams. Like today in court, I'd say 70% of my cases, the lawyers are appearing online. The defendants come in online. That never was the case before. Everybody used to be in person. So suddenly I'm just looking at a lot of talking heads, and you can evaluate credibility, but it's harder. It really is. You don't have the entire person in front of you. At least we're not wearing masks anymore.
Yes. Yeah,
that was really
talking to someone who's a defendant with their face covered must have been interesting.
Yeah, well, that's when I retired. So I missed all of that, thank goodness, because that was something I really wasn't looking forward to. Another area that I've seen the change in, and this is in civil litigation, not criminal litigation, but in civil, there really is a decline in collegiality among the lawyers themselves, especially in a large community like Los Angeles. A lot of the people practice what I would call hit and run law. They don't treat their colleagues well. They don't extend courtesies. They're nasty. They fight. They call names. It's much worse than it was when I became a judge in 1994, and I thought it was pretty bad back then. There are attempts going on to try to force civility back into the code of conduct of the bar. In fact, one judge I know on the Court of Appeal has been spearheading this in California, and he's now heading a committee that I think has just persuaded the state bar to write a civility clause or paragraph, if you will, into the code of conduct, because it's just really bad. And I've seen letters and emails going back and forth where people call each other names and they use profanity. It's just not dignified the way it used to be. Now,
has that happened? Is that generational, or is that, toward younger lawyers coming in with a different habit and ethic, or is that sort of just a general slide across the board, no matter what your age?
I've seen it at every age. I've had people say to me, well, the millennials have their own attitude and they're much more self-absorbed, and that's why they do it. I don't know if that's true or not. I can't opine, but I've seen people my age or even in the silent generation acting like jerks too. It's hard to say, but it's sad. It really is. Now, on the criminal side, you rarely see that. You rarely do. The defense lawyers and the prosecutors generally get along. The court where I'm sitting this week, it's a loving. They agree with each other. There are minimal disagreements. They know what they need to do. They do their jobs, and it's a pleasure. Once in a while, you get somebody who's difficult, but much more. It's much rarer than it is on the civil side. And I've had both. This week I've got a mental health assignment. A couple of weeks ago I had a civil assignment. Last month I had criminal cases. And as a full-time judge, I did both as well. In fact, I sat pro tem on the Court of Appeal and heard a triple murder, 2-defendant gang case, which was shocking in its facts, just shocking. But the lawyers got along.
I have a question for you, which segues out of that one in terms of just the kind of things you've seen, from a lay person's point of view, observing the rise and fall of crime in the states, homelessness, and all these other things. There just seems to be a kind of, not an arc, but an ebb and flow in all of this, whether the, fixing the broken windows idea of policing or arresting people for smaller crimes, because they tend to be the same population that commit the bigger ones, the kind of tent cities we see springing up in places like Portland and elsewhere, Los Angeles being another one. I'm just wondering, from your position as a judge, having looked at this over a span of time now, a quarter of a century, in that position, whether you have some general observations about what works and what doesn't in terms of just producing a civil society, whether it's the lawyers appearing in front of you who are less polite than they were at another point, to watching mass lootings of stores where they have to close because there's so much shoplifting. I'm not someone who gets panicked by a, quote, sudden spike in crime, because I was held up at gunpoint in New York City in 1972, and then it became a very safe place, that's sort of a tourist mecca. So it isn't always a slide toward, things can change and get better too. But what have
Goes
you
back and
seen?
forth.
Yeah.
Remember,
What have you
Nixon
seen?
campaigned on a law and order platform.
What's that?
When Nixon ran, he ran on a law and order platform because there
Right.
was a lot of crime in 1968.
So I'm just curious as to what your observations would be in terms of worse, better, indifferent, cyclical mistakes that may have been made. I'll just throw one out that I think, needs to be discussed more honestly and openly, that, a lot of folks on the left, from a civil liberties point of view, wanted to empty what we used to call asylums, and that population suddenly hit the streets. Nobody came along from the conservative side to fund any kind of rehabilitation. And between the two of them, they created a situation that it's in no one's interest to be honest about. Let's just take that for a start, because I'm sure that's impacted.
You've said it, Frank. You've said it better than I can. I mean, you don't have enough facilities to treat people. Mental health doesn't get the resources it should get. They're just and as a result, you have a lot of people on the streets, and a lot of people with mental health troubles get violent, or they'll steal, or they'll attack, they'll lash out. And then the other problem is you don't have enough resources to deal with them, to hold them in custody. So the jails are overcrowded, and suddenly people were let go because of that. I remember when I was starting off as a judge and I was sitting in misdemeanor courts, the jails were overcrowded. I'd sentence somebody to 30 days. They were out within 2 hours.
Mm-hmm.
And they knew it. And the public defenders would tell them. I heard the PDs telling their clients in open court, don't worry, you'll be out by tonight. Well, that's not deterring anybody.
Yeah.
The other problem, Frank, is that for a lot of people, being in jail or being in prison is not that much of a punishment. It's just another phase of your life. You're in custody, you see your friends, you're getting 3 meals, you're getting a place to stay, or what they call 3 hots and a cot. And they're being told what to do, which is fine because maybe they need that guidance. And then they're released. Now they're on the outside. They may not know what to do. They go back with their other group of friends. Then they're back in custody when they reoffend. And, it's not that horrible of a punishment. If you or I ended up in jail for a week, it would, I'm not sure. I for one, don't think I could put up with it. I think I'd decompose. But somebody who's been there a lot or has a home life that's violent and dangerous, well, for them, it might even be safer to be in custody. We've had people who have walked into police stations on a cold night and said, I'm holding a Coke pipe, arrest me. And, possession of drug paraphernalia can be a crime. It's usually a misdemeanor. So they get arrested. Now they're going to get a free night in jail and a meal.
Yeah.
They'll plead guilty the next day. What do they care? They're not going to be, up for a position that needs Senate confirmation. So what if they have something on their record?
Yeah, it brings up a point of a kind of a class system we have in this country. I've been reading quite a bit about the fact, speaking of Harvard, that you're involved with on a lot of different levels. We have this kind of self-perpetuating upper class that, speaking of divorce, was not as affected. And, they're still getting married. They're still having children within 2-parent households and so forth. You've got a whole underclass which is really suffering from the results of a kind of a breakdown. How do you, from your eagle-eyed view on the bench, see that playing out? Lack of mental health facilities. At the same time, we've opened up all the asylums and said, well, there is no such thing as mental health issues. Decriminalize all these things. Are we on a kind of a doom loop here, politics aside, insurrection aside, or do you see this playing out as just another learning curve within the U.S. experience of life that somehow in the end will come right?
Well, I hope for the latter. Really, it's all about money. We need funding. And if we had the funding, we could, have more facilities, more treatment available for the mentally ill. But we don't have that. And, whatever money we have, it's probably going to go to other things. It may have to go to defense, given the fact that, you and I lived through the early 2000s. that was a golden time. It was like we weren't, at least, we weren't alive enough or conscious enough to remember 1948, 1949,
Right.
when we had a monopoly on atomic bombs and everything was great and there was no danger to this country. Well, the 2000s were the same way. There were no enemies out there. We beat them all. They were dead.
Yeah.
There might be some loose nukes running around, but we were running around picking them up. And countries like Ukraine and Kazakhstan said, we don't want to have our nuclear weapons here. Boris Yeltsin, take them. Let's store them safely. And everybody thought, things were wonderful. And we had that quote unquote peace dividend. Well, guess what? We don't have it now. And there's a lot of pressure to spend more money on defense.
Yeah, I'm talking with Superior Court Judge and author of Every Other Weekend, Coming of Age with Two Different Dads, Anthony Mohr. We're in the middle right now, and will be when this is playing out still, of this whole business with Trump. And of course, courts are involved. There are judges involved who will be setting trial dates on these various indictments. From the point of view of being a judge, I'm really curious and would like to spend the rest of this interview picking your brains on not just how you see this in terms of the insurrection itself or what Trump did or didn't do, but how do you see this playing out? And if you don't want to commit to giving us a scenario, give us a couple. What's going to happen?
I don't know.
First, I've never been through this. What's going on here? First
of all, I have to give you a caution, and that is we have a canon in the California Code of Judicial Ethics. It's canon 3B9, if I'm not mistaken, which does not allow a judge to comment on a pending case.
Okay.
I can't sit here and say, oh, I believe, he's this or he's that, or here's what's going to happen in the course, because A, I don't know, and B, I'm not allowed to talk about it. I could talk about a case that's over. I could talk to you about the O.J. Simpson case, because that's over with. But I can't talk to you about any of the Trump cases.
What about, forget the case then, let me rephrase this, or you help me rephrase it in a way that gets something interesting, because I know you've been around the block a lot. Forget the judge point of view, just someone who's seen some things and lived through some political experiences, and also the relationship experiences of a family man who has come from a family, from two men who formed you. What makes the Trump years possible in your view? What changed that allowed this to happen? My contention is that the evangelical voter who got behind Trump to the degree of 83%, if polls were correct, exit polls were correct, somehow bought into what he was saying as a kind of a guarantee that, a world that was moving too fast and that they found scary or they were losing control of in terms of white majorities, whatever it may be. But how do you explain the fact that it has gone as far as it has up to the point of these indictments, when, again, like you were saying back in the day, you would have bet somehow this would not have happened, or it would be, you'd say, hey, this is fiction, it's not going to happen.
I don't know.
What's your perspective on where we're at?
Well, what caused it? Your guess is as good as mine. It might be fear, of things happening too fast. It might be resentment of the quote unquote overclass. There's probably a good dose of racism there, because remember, Barack Obama was president. And how hopeful as we were in 2008 when he won, and we thought maybe the whole race issue can be put to rest, a lot of people didn't put it to rest. And there might be a lot of people who said, okay, we've had enough of, an African-American president. We're going to go the other way. There are people who said, DC has always been, ossified or corrupt or gridlock, whatever it is. We need somebody to completely upset the apple cart and start all over again. I mean, I'm just throwing out possibilities as to why people voted the way they did. Although we still know that the single biggest determinant of the way you vote is how your parents voted. That's about the best thought I can give you on what happened.
How do you look in terms of the fallout on this from the point of view of just what comes next in terms of the American story as you've observed it unfold, very consciously from the 50s forward,
Well,
into our present era. I mean, where are we at?
well, as a baby boomer who believes that we're not through yet, let me still say it may be that not much is going to change until the baby boomers go off stage. There's a book by Charlotte Alter called The Ones We've Been Waiting For. And she talks about, the millennials, to some degree, Generation X. And she's very complimentary of the generation. And I think maybe it's time that maybe we just wait for this generation, as I said, to, sail away and things may change.
This generation being you and me.
Correct. And and don't forget and the silent generation. I mean, Joe Biden is the first person in the silent generation to become president. We've had two or three. I think we've had two baby boomers, Clinton and Trump. And I think, is Obama baby boomer or is he Gen X?
Good question. I'd have to think of his birth date and figure it out.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think
he's a boomer. My producer just said he's a boomer.
Okay, there you go. So 3 baby boomers have been president, ahead of a member of the silent generation. And before that, you had, quote unquote, the greatest generation. So there you are.
Yeah, there you go. We need to wrap this up in a minute, but I want to get to something else. And that is that going back to your book here for a second, I'm curious in terms of when you were writing the book, how it came about.
Well, let me just say, when I say baby boomers, I'm sorry, George W. Bush is also.
Yes, George W. Bush, exactly. When you were writing Every Other Weekend, coming of age with 2 different dads, first of all, how did this come about? You're being a judge and you're doing this, and okay, now you're writing this wonderfully articulated book, this kind of slice of life. Take a look at, your own coming of age through that lens. What's the story behind the book?
Well, there was a very close family friend. Name was Doris Halsey. She was a literary agent. She and her husband ran the Reese Halsey Agency, and they were my parents' age, and we knew each other pretty well. And somewhere around 1980, she said to me, "Look, you've got an amazing story because of your 2 fathers. Why don't you write about it?" Well, I was too busy being a lawyer. I never really thought about taking on a book project. Then I became a judge. And she said it again. Come on, this is a story you should write. And now that you're a judge, you really have sort of an endpoint. And I was too busy being a judge. But I was periodically, as I mentioned earlier in the show, I was doing some creative writing. And I went to a writers' conference. It was then called the Squaw Valley Writers Workshop. Now it's called the Community of Writers. And a couple of people there urged me to tell the story. One of the pieces I submitted to go there was about the Santa Claus Lane Parade. And it was a short piece, maybe 1,300 words. But the instructor who read it said, "I really like this. I'd like you to do something longer." And he and I talked. And I finally came away from that thinking, okay, I'm going to write some essays about the mid-'60s and growing up with my dad or with Stan. And I did that. And maybe I wrote about 7, 8, 9 essays. And then finally, when the pandemic came along, I figured, all right, maybe this should turn into a memoir. And I turned them into a memoir and added some material. Presto, that was the book.
Did you go back to that agency?
Unfortunately, Doris died.
Yeah.
She was my parents' age, and she died. Had she been alive, of course, I would have used them.
Yeah, because I didn't read the acknowledgements. I wasn't fishing for that, but obviously in there you would have mentioned who your agent was and publisher. So what was your experience with publishing the book itself? Just the nuts and bolts of an agency and an editor and all the rest of it.
I did not shoot for an agent. Basically, I figured, all right, I'm 74 years old or whatever I was at the time.
Yeah.
And I knew how hard it is to get an agent.
Yeah.
And I knew how hard it is to get a big publisher, a big 5 publisher. And I didn't want the book to come out when I was 82 years old.
Right. Good thinking.
As soon as I could. So I compromised. I said, okay, I'm going to submit to some indie publishers. And one of my judicial colleagues had a novel brought out by Kohler, and he loved them. He had very good experiences with them. Yeah. So I submitted and I got lucky.
That's great. good story in itself. And by the way, to those of you watching and listening to this podcast In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, that lucky is not what happened. Somebody read this book and saw in it what I see in Judge Anthony's book, and that is it's a beautifully, beautifully written memoir, and very moving, by the way. I think, you know, it's so different to see. I've just seen the movie Barbie, and of course, in that, one of her things is that, you know, the Ken character, what it means to be a man is problematic, not just from a feminist point of view, but just in terms of our moment of history. As you know, as a judge, from the people who are coming before you, being a man is a little difficult these days, although we talk a lot more about women's issues and women's problems. But it just seems to me that this book has been published at the right time and place, because a lot of us are out there asking questions in terms of what is the place of men, the male of the species, in this milieu that we're in. And you know, the Ken and Barbie story is another examination of this. By the way, that's what her movie is really about. It's called Barbie, but it should be called Ken, which some people may not like, because it's really an examination of the place of men in our culture, having assumptions about the place of women. So I want to go there before we leave. Your book is about these two men who are these two role models, and then you have lived this incredible life as a judge, and you're looking at it now in retrospect, and you're also still doing a great deal through the ALI at Social Impact Review at Harvard. Let's finish by talking about what your book's really about, which is, you know, who are men these days? What are we? What are you and I? And how do we figure into the grand scheme of things now? And what's the future of being a male in this culture?
Good question. What's the future? I really don't know. I came away from writing the book thinking, you know, both my dad and Stan were two good men who had plenty of faults, but they tried their best. They tried their best to raise me and do the right thing, not only with me, but with Stan with his own two children. And then my father had two stepchildren through his second wife, and he tried with them as well. The good news is they all turned out well. They all turned out well. I want to see Barbie. It's funny to end on it, because I'm trying to persuade my wife to see it. She has no desire to, but I'm planning to see it probably next week. And you know, because I've read that you know, it's really the story of Ken.
Yeah, it is.
Ironically, a lot of my book is the story of my mother.
Yes, no, I was in fact literally about to say that. That's so it's pretty funny. You should have just interviewed yourself. We'll tape it and put it out. You're thinking along the same line. Start your own podcast. That's your next step.
There you go.
You've got good. Yeah, because I was going to say, isn't it odd? Because, you know, I write memoirs and they're not really about me. They're about my relationship with Jeannie and our long trek as a married couple over these decades we've been together. You know, isn't that odd how all our stories turn out to be about the people who are, you know, who make us who we are? And of course, for both of your dads, you know, that's the women in their lives. Women, not necessarily wives, because there's that story too. You know, I mean, they're both shaped by that, aren't they?
Right. Yeah, no, my mother is the unsung hero of the piece, as is the school. The teachers I had at Beverly High, they were really superb people. My English teacher from junior year and I are still friends. We still are in touch.
And how old a person is that now?
He'll be 88 later on this summer.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah.
And has he had a chance to read the book?
He did. Yeah, he was very impressed. And
yeah, maybe if I knew his name, I would have found him in the blurbs up front.
I think I mentioned him in the blurbs, Tom Quinlan.
Yeah, I mean, you know, my favorite student or something like that.
Something like that. I know Mr. Ockapenny, Sal Ockapenny, is in the book. Mr. Quinlan is not, although he is in an essay that the Los Angeles Review just published. I wrote a lot about him in an English paper I wrote, and it's called "The Only Child at the Party," and it's the latest essay to come out. It came out last month, but those two and other teachers were really wonderful, and they became a stable center of my world. I was, you know, shuttlecocking between two households.
Yeah, no, I really love the story, and I think that it's just such a beautiful book. I mean, in my head, in a funny way, you've told it so well. It doesn't read like a work of nonfiction or a memoir. It reads like a good novel. I mean, you really get drawn into the story. You really want to know, how does this go? How does it end? I would, you know, that stupid thing they used to do in movie reviews of 5 stars and all that. But however many stars one is able to give, I would say to everybody that Judge Anthony's book, Every Other Weekend, is something you ought to read. Speaking of which, if people want to get in contact you, Ernie will place whatever you want up and posted with this interview so that folks can follow what you're doing to whatever extent you want that to happen.
Thank you.
Is there anything you want people to do for you who will listen to this other than go to Amazon and buy the book as soon as you finish listening to this interview?
And if you like it, review it. Put
Yeah,
it up,
do,
put up a
do,
review
do.
on Amazon or on Goodreads or both.
Yes, I will do that in addition to putting this out. And I would just urge people to get the book. You will be glad you did. Is there something that you would like to say that I've forgotten to ask you about?
I think we've covered it. And Frank, I really want to thank you. This has been a delightful hour. And
yeah, me too.
I'm really flattered and honored that you have taken the time to read it and spend this time with me talking.
Yeah, and I will bet anybody that reads Every Other Weekend will never have read a better opening to a book or a better first chapter in any book that you've recently read. I would lay that out there as a bet with anyone who reads this. You will be stunned. And I would encourage you to keep writing because, you know, you're a real writer. And I think that if you now look back over their time as a judge and what you've seen, I think you have a lifetime of material ahead of you. So stick around and process it and give us some more books.
I'll do my best. Thank you again. That's so much.
Right. This has been such a pleasure.